Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Bree Dyer, and I'm a senior here at UConn studying human rights and global studies. Today is dedicated to genocide awareness and prevention, and this panel is the core of that movement, so to speak, because each panelist has dedicated their careers to this goal. And so we first have Dr. Glenn Matoma, the director of DOD Impact. We have Stuart Abrams, known as Stu, who's my former genocide education teacher at Avon High School. We have Erna Alex, my partner in crime with this symposium and a good friend who also has connections to the Srebrenica genocide, as well as Claire Sarnowski, who is a high school student in Oregon who has just been a large role, who has had a large role in advocating for genocide education in her district. So I'm just so excited to have this panel and all these familiar, friendly faces. And I want to start off, let me find my questions. I would like to start off with the question, and Glenn, I'm going to direct it to you first, but anyone can jump in. It's a very co-moderated event between all of us. But the question is, how do you think genocide differs from a high school level to a undergraduate and graduate level? Is the setup different? Is what involved different? How does it change?
Yeah, that's a good question, Bree, and thank you for inviting me, and really congratulations, and thank you for organizing, what is a really tremendous day, week, set of activities. I can't think of a more important set of topics to be engaging, and I can't be more grateful to be on the panel with, my good friends here. So thank you. And so the question about the difference between genocide education at the undergraduate or graduate level and high school, as with many things, it's a question of degree, and we have to think about what the backgrounds and the particular readiness of our students are in every one of those contexts. And I think I'm sure Stu has some great insights on how it would work at the high school level. But one of the things that we do at the college level for sure is think about how it integrates with the broader human rights program at the University of Connecticut, right? That we are very much centered on a human rights-based approach to genocide education and to connecting it with other courses and curriculum that develop students' capacity both to understand genocide as a phenomenon, but also the skills, attitudes, and relationships necessary to take action in the prevention or addressing of genocide more broadly. So, my approach, for instance, in the course that I teach, really takes an interdisciplinary look, but then articulates it directly with opportunities for students to take action in a variety of contexts, whether that's documentation and research, commemoration and memory, political advocacy and organization, right, across a range of areas. And then, of course, as you move your way up into the graduate fields, a lot of that is going to be determined by the particular focus of a graduate program's specialization. So certainly we have a kind of rich humanities-based tradition of inquiry within genocide and Holocaust studies that many of my colleagues in literatures, cultures, and languages, or English, or drama, or other fields pursue. But then we also have practical programs. Our School of Social Work runs a program in partnership with Armenia that explores the Armenian genocide alongside of developing professional competencies for social workers. So, you can see the way this kind of fit together as we move up, through the educational system.
Absolutely. And I know one of the reasons I chose UConn was because of its human rights program. And Avon High School, which Stu can talk about, um, I guess kind of combed me for that or groomed me in a way where I learned about human rights and genocide in high school and was able to take that interest to college. So, Stu, do you want to talk about, I guess, how you formulate genocide education and how important you think it is to the high school level students.
Sure. Thanks. Bree, also, before I start, I can't thank you enough for inviting me to be a part of today, a part of this panel, a part of the symposium. It's an honor to be included in all of this. Well, as far as high school goes, as I was listening to Glenn speak, one of the issues is I think what we do at the high school level is foundational in the idea that we know that as you move along to the later stages, whether it be undergraduate or graduate work, what you're offered there without that foundational knowledge, and with all due respect, Glenn, I would almost make the argument that what we do at the secondary level might be arguably more important in the sense, because without that, students like Bree don't come along. And so I think that I think of it as a more foundational piece, which doesn't eliminate the idea that not only do we try and give the content and teach about genocide, we also want to give students agency. And even if at the high school level, their ability to be active in some of these movements might not be there. And obviously a university, especially at the world-class university like UConn, you have connections and ways in which to reach out to other groups that at the high school level we just don't. So essentially what I'm suggesting is that without this high school level, I'm not sure how successful the higher ed level would be. So, and plus the fact, the last thing I'll say is in terms of time, I think at the high school level, we're often crunched for time in a way that those at the higher ed level are not. And so we somehow have, I mean, when you look at, even at Avon High School, if I look at our textbooks, there is not mention of any genocide post 1994. And I'm guessing there have been some. And so that's a bit of a problem. And so, and that's where I think we fall a bit short at the secondary level.
I completely agree with you, Stu, that there is an importance to helping students understand at the high school level what this concept is, because I can remember in several history classes before having you as a teacher that there would be maybe one sentence on the Armenian genocide, a whole chapter on the Holocaust, understandably and absolutely appropriately so, and then nothing. And so, Claire, I want to bring you in on this discussion of, because you've played a large role in advocating for genocide education. How did you get involved with it, but also how did you understand the importance at your age as well?
Yes, for sure. And like, I just want to echo what everyone said. Thank you so much for having me. And for all the attendees, I'm really proud and honored to be able to be here and share my story and experience with you also. Thank you so much for having me and for really putting on this symposium. I know it took a lot of hard work. But firstly, I got involved because when I was in 4th grade, I was able to meet a Holocaust survivor. And in Oregon, it isn't like in New York or Florida where there is a large abundance of Holocaust survivors. There are very few here. And so being able to have the opportunity to meet Alter Wiener, a Holocaust survivor, was so inspiring for me. And we were able to build a friendship, which included me visiting his home and being able to really make a connection. We were very similar in terms of our life mission of making the world a better place and both wanting to educate people. And that was something that we both shared a commonality, even though there were so many years that separated us in terms of age. And being able to build a friendship, he mentioned to me many times that it was his dream to mandate Holocaust and genocide education for Oregon. And he had tried many times through many different avenues with different people in the legislature, but it could just never go through, and it never got the support it needed to really get off the ground. When I was going into my freshman year of high school, and I was 14 years old, and I decided that I wanted to make a difference to help Alter. And what I did was I reached out to my school board just to see what was in our school district in Lake Oswego. And what I found was that there wasn't really anything that said you have to teach this. Yes, there may have been a suggestion to teach an excerpt out of the Diary of Anne Frank, but it was stated what needed to be done to have a base level understanding of genocide education. And the more research I did, the more I found that this was happening in surrounding districts. So I was able to be put in touch with somebody who was also on the school board, a parent of a student in the district, and a newly elected state senator. His name was Rob Wagner. And we were able to talk. And so I presented him other bills. I had all kinds of research that I'd done from other mandates. And we went over things and we decided that we wanted to try to get something done. So my role in kind of spearheading all this was getting the back end of support, getting people to testify. I testified at every hearing, getting people to write their testimony. And the turnout was so big that they had to have an overflow room with state capitol when they had the first hearing. And to see the amount of people who valued this education and who didn't get this education but got it later in life and knew the valuable lessons that can be learned, thought it was so important. So that is kind of my role, and the bill did get signed into law, and Alter unfortunately passed away halfway through. He was tragically hit by a car, and it was extremely unexpected and such a tragic loss. However, his legacy will live on, and the legacy of other Holocaust and genocide survivors will too, through the bill that was signed into law in 2019. So it was definitely something that I was very proud to mandate Oregon, which became the 11th state at the time, and there are more that have followed. But being able to see how impactful that legislation is at the high school level or secondary school, because of how much it sets the foundation for further learning on not just genocide, but also human rights in general. I definitely think that when we look at genocide, we can look at the precursors that involve human rights violations and really go from there when looking at how students want to not only approach these issues in their studies, but how they career in them, as well as get involved at further levels, such as interning at local organizations or even studying it in college.
No, I mean you're such an inspiration for advocating for this at the high school level, and I know Stu, you also have experience with discussing, Connecticut legislature with genocide education. But I want to focus, Claire, on what you said about how you were inspired by a Holocaust survivor in fourth grade, and I know I've also had experiences listening to people's just stories that are history. And Erna, you have direct connection with the Srebrenica genocide, so you're not hearing it from, so to speak, like I don't know, you know what I'm trying to say. Like you have a direct connection. So can you speak to that and how that's played a role in your advocacy work for genocide education?
Yeah, of course. So I guess I do have a kind of a direct sort of role in genocide, as I'm like first generation genocide survivor in a way. My parents have survived the Srebrenica genocide in 1995. They have migrated here to the United States. So and it's only been 25 years since the genocide in Srebrenica. So it's a very current thing going on, and the trauma that holds in our communities is still very much there. So I believe that for me, I kind of had this in my mind that my parents were survivors the whole time, and in a way that kind of pushed my sort of course of like life and like advocacy and academic work to kind of follow and how can I make something that happened to like personally to me not affect others. And it kind of puts me like, yes, I have a personal relation, but making it more of like, how can I help the other communities that may be affected as I have, and kind of maybe stepping out a little bit. I had to step out my personal beliefs as well and my personal connection to understand everyone else, and making solidarity movements as well between other genocide survivors. So that's kind of my advocacy has went through there, and I inspired in a way, and distraught that my family had to go through something as atrocious as being murdered or being systematically murdered and discriminated against in 1995 to having to fight for this. And I guess for also in my path, I really believe that we needed to make more preventive measures and take more preventive measures to stop what has happened, and advocate for the ones that we may not consider genocide right now, but are at the brinks of genocide, and that we are again, or mass atrocities. And our activism should include all of these other issues that go hand in hand. So that's kind of how my course of work has been, and I've been really big advocate on genocide awareness, and again, I advocate against genocide denial as well, and making people aware of what genocide denial looks like, because it is very dangerous, especially when it comes to the trauma, the stigmatization, the pursues even more hatred in the society, and allows essentially genocide to reoccur.
Bree, if I can just jump in real quickly.
Please do, yes.
Talking about listening to survivors, you don't have to be in 4th grade to be inspired. The greatest teacher I have ever had, Abby Weiner, was a Holocaust survivor. And for whatever reason, thank goodness it happened. I'll always be thankful. But Abby taught me things that went well beyond the history of the event, and motivates me to still, not that people couldn't do it as well, if not better than I do, but I'm still working primarily because of Abby. I mean, I loved him, and as a teacher, there was nobody that was more inspirational for me than Abby was.
No, I definitely believe that a teacher makes a course in any subject matter, but I think that is essential for genocide education because it can be a very heavy topic. I know in our class, 7:40 in the morning on Mondays was our class, and it wasn't always the easiest way to start the week, but you somehow have this aura of you that makes a student feel comfortable in the class. And so I want to discuss with everyone and get their different perspectives on what are the key elements of a genocide education class? Is it a certain type of teacher? Is it certain curriculum elements? Like what are some key elements that you think make genocide education more able to be received by students in high school? And so Glenn, or Stu, I can start with you, and then Glenn, if you want to follow.
Sure, I'll be quick. I think the first word that jumped into my mind is passion. I think students pick up on teachers that lack passion, whether it's math teachers who are passionate about triangles, which I don't quite understand, but that's why I don't teach math. But that kind of passion is an essential quality. And the other thing, and the way you described the class, Bree, thank you. But we know that learning is a contact sport, and teaching and learning about genocide is probably the NFL of learning, because it is as difficult a topic, not so much to understand the concepts all the time, but the emotions that it evokes. And the art of teaching is being able to create this climate, this vibe of safety for students, so that they know that they can talk about these things and demonstrate emotion in a way that they know it's okay. And even at 7:40 in the morning, which tough, but anyway, that's kind of what I think is essential to having this happen. But it is the art of teaching this material. It's not, and it changes. It's every class has a different chemistry to it, and you have to somehow figure it out and go from there. So, Glenn.
Yeah, and obviously, I mean, I think, Stu's record speaks for itself. I can't think of anybody in the state who's really had more transformative effect on his students than Stu. And, we get many of them at the University of Connecticut, and they come in really feeling that passion and that commitment. And I think that's absolutely right, that a teacher who cares both for the subject matter and their students is a teacher that's going to do well in this. Beyond that, though, I'll say, our approach, again, not to kind of keep emphasizing this, but it's true here, is a human rights education approach to this, and that informs the three key elements in the classroom, which is what to teach, why to teach it, and how to teach it. In the what to teach range, right, a human rights-based approach says, of course, you've got to get the history right. There's a kind of foundational basis that you need to teach clearly and accurately about the past. But beyond that core content, you also need to be focused on developing student skills and attitudes that allow them not only to understand, but then to act on what they've learned. The why to teach, right, is really important here, and to get clarity as an educator on the purposes and outcomes that you want to have from your course. Maybe it goes without saying, but it's really important to specify up front that any genocide education course should be fundamentally an anti-genocide education course, which is to say your obligation, your purpose for teaching the course has to include a commitment to the prevention and redress of genocide as a phenomenon in the world. If it's just a dry topic that you're trying to unpack for students, you're really not getting at what the core of genocide education should be. And I'll say, again, in my perspective, an anti-genocide education means a pro-human rights education, one that advances the basic dignity and fundamental rights of everyone, within your classroom and beyond. And then the final piece is how. And I think, Stu, you hinted at this, about this idea, right, of being able to show emotion, to be able to engage with difficult materials. That is not only difficult because it's intellectually hard to grasp. I mean, again, we are dealing with stuff that is at the limits of the human experience, and that's difficult to understand. But it's also difficult because it touches on trauma. Trauma in the past, but also trauma in the present. Erna, I'm really grateful that you've joined us today and to lend your perspective, because it makes clear that our students are not distant from these phenomena oftentimes. They are part of their families' histories. They're part of their current experiences oftentimes. And if you're not approaching your classroom in a way that is informed by that knowledge of what your students and what yourself are bringing into that space, you're not going to be able to create the environment that Stu creates, in which people feel safe to, explore these difficult topics in a way that shows their vulnerability, but ultimately leads to growth. So I think those are the key elements that allow for a genocide education classroom to be productive on all ends.
No, I completely agree with you, and I think passion is important, and getting the content right and showing emotion are definitely key elements. And I mean, the makeup of this panel is intentional. We do have 2 instructors, we do have 2 students. So I would love, now that the instructors have talked about the importance of genocide education and what needs to be present, I want to get Erna and then Claire, your response to that, and as well as personal experiences that you've had within genocide education that have stuck with you and that you think are pertinent to the discussion and that you want to share.
Yeah, I really think that something that Gunn said is the anti-genocidal aspect of a genocide educational class. That's kind of the way of making even the anti-genocidal movement, essentially, that we need throughout our campaigns and any advocacy that we do. I think in a genocide educational class, I really want to see a sort of an intersectional aspect between other coursework and other topics, like anti-racism courses very much go hand in hand with anti-genocide, because discrimination is a key part in the stages of genocide. And if we don't sort of highlight those aspects in our discussions, we kind of forget how genocide even comes about. And words, as even people may think that words are not as big or issue, or the language that we use, which we will talk about in our language panel probably later on today, discriminatory racist slurs, discriminatory language, whatever, that actually is one of the bigger aspects on why genocide happens. It's the hatred ends up coming out of those words, and then violence, and then genocide. So for me, it's sort of interacting all these elements within that we learn, and promoting this anti-genocidal movement within our classes, so it can be not only an educational aspect, but education within an advocacy as well. So what do we, like, what can we take out of it? How can we pursue more after this? Do we just sit in here in class, take notes? Or like some of the hands-on work that we can do within the classrooms? And I've been really interested in working on that as well. And I took a human rights advocacy course last semester, and it was a lot of making my own campaign. And I think Claire kind of did exactly that on her own, which is amazing what you did. But that's kind of what I want to see sort of on the long run within the classes that we take on topics of crimes against humanity, genocide, or international criminal law as well.
Awesome. I love your answer. Claire, do you want to add on to that?
Yeah, sure. And I definitely think that I will add on more to what I would like to see in terms of genocide education courses, just because I am a junior in high school and I haven't had the opportunity yet to take any university level courses on this topic. But I think this panel definitely made me want to take some more. So that is definitely something that I'm getting out of this just as a panelist. But in terms of what I want to see as a student, and no matter what class I'm in, I definitely think what Stu said about the passion of the teacher is kind of so important. You definitely can feel when you have a teacher that's passionate about something, you can feel the energy in the room. And when you're talking about humanity at its worst, when it comes to genocide, students of all ages, no matter if you were in grad school or if you were just a freshman in high school, need to have that commitment and that ability for a teacher to be able to really handle an emotional and heavy topic, especially one that causes trauma or has been embedded in trauma due to their previous life experiences, or if they have a family member who has endured the trauma of an atrocity, or a friend. It definitely is something that is very important and needs to be sensitized, but also at the same time, there just needs to be an open window for people to be able to talk about and feel comfortable to be able to share their experiences and feel that they can also learn at the same time. Additionally, just adding on, I also think too, being able to understand that when you're learning about these people, make it personable. These people aren't just statistics. They're not just people in the history books. These are people with names. And then a lot of times when we look at them, there are millions of people. And so there are people that we may know who are the great grandchildren of these people, the grandchildren, maybe even the son, child, these survivors, or who have perished during these events. And when we really personalize it, it gives us an aspect on these were people, these were their lives, they had names, they had lives, and this was all taken away from them because of genocide and the hatred that others had mentioned on the panel. And I think it's very important that when we are looking and we are analyzing these issues, instead of looking at just a staggering number that like breaks your heart when you look at it, we focus on who these people were and their legacies that continue to live on. And I think when we think about it in that way, it gives us a much more compassionate and a much more human approach. Like we could be one of them, and understanding how we can better come out of the course, come out of the class, not just a genocide class, any history, humanitarian class, anything along that sense, even English to some degree, being able to come out of that a better person. How can we actively combat hatred? How can we stand against prejudice? How can we be upstanders rather than bystanders in situations of oppression, whether it's in our school, whether it's in a political setting, whether it's in the workplace? And what can we do to do our part? We don't have to be genocide education experts or have all this knowledge in order to stand and be against genocide. We can be doing this in our daily lives. And so having these classes to not only equip us with the knowledge needed, but also the tool of education, which I think is the greatest tool at our disposal, to not only make a difference in the class, but also make a difference in our lives.
Yes, thank you. And before I forget, I briefly want to address the audience. Thank you so much for your questions. Keep them coming. Keep typing as we're talking about this, as we're going to address them in around 15 minutes in the last like 11:45 onwards to 12. We will get to your questions. But Claire, I want to focus on one thing that you said about statistics. And I completely agree with you that if there is not a course dedicated to genocide education, it's just statistics, because in a history class there will be a day or a week dedicated to the Holocaust, and that's it. And so I think we've clearly established that genocide education in its own right is crucial to the high school curriculum, but where does the responsibility lie in making this a thing, so to speak? Is it federal to mandate genocide education across the state or the nation? Is it up to its own district, to the school itself? Like where, Glenn, I'm going to start with you on this one. Where do you think the responsibility lies?
Sure. You'll be unsatisfied to know I think it lies everywhere, right? So, there's not a silver bullet for this. And, in general, I'm less inclined to think that the solution to questions about what we're going to teach in our classroom need to be mandates from the federal government. We have a very decentralized education system in this country. So, the idea that there would be some sort of mandate with respect to genocide education that came down would be out of keeping and out of character with how we've done education policy generally. I think at the state level, there's a role to play, in each state for having the state legislature set priorities and goals, how that looks and sounds and works. I think there's a lot of different approaches to that. But I think the real key here, and you won't be surprised to hear this, is actually teachers and providing the necessary resources, time, development, relationships that teachers can develop the necessary knowledge and skills to do good genocide education in their classrooms. And what that looks like, I think that the federal government definitely has a really important leadership role to play there, providing, for instance, grant funding that would allow for partnerships with universities, like ours, that have robust resources in terms of research on genocide and genocide education, and to sponsor cohorts of teachers, both pre and in service, to do deep dives into the content, to develop communities of practice with one another, to develop the techniques and strategies to be able to come back together to problem solve around challenges they're addressing, and to really have the support all the way through their systems, from their buildings to their school districts up through the Department of Education, to say that this really matters to us and it's really important and we're going to give you the time and resources to make that happen. It's very different from then, the idea that you could solve it by simply writing a law that says everybody has to do this and then walking away from it. Those kind of unfunded mandates can be in fact counterproductive, because then what you get is a lot of people trying to check boxes and say, all right, we've got to do this. So, Dave over there, you maybe know something about, why don't you teach the hog? And if that teacher doesn't know where to start, doesn't feel connected, doesn't feel able, he's not going to really do a good service to his students in presenting that material. So that's where I would put my time and energy.
Yeah, if I could jump in, I think what Glenn is describing is very much what we have in the state of Connecticut in terms of a mandate that is not funded by the state, which perhaps was part of the reason the state passed that requirement for secondary schools. But without the funding, it makes it very challenging. I mean, we have individual groups throughout the state that are working very hard to accomplish this. But it would be, I think, much more effective if we had state support beyond just the rubber stamp, because I think you're right, Glenn, that box checking becomes a problem. And with that said, I think there's also an assault on the humanities throughout public education. If you ask students, well, why are you here? Why do you want to go to college? Well, I want to get a better job. I want to make more money. That seems to me to be, the wrong answer to a very reasonable question. It's as if at the high school level, it's almost as if the tail wagging the dog that students are in classes to meet certain requirements and have a certain grade point average and be prepared for the standardized testing and all of those things. That to me is backwards. That's the focus. Are we in education to make the world a better place. I don't know if that was Claire that mentioned that. Somebody mentioned making the world a better place. Isn't that what we're all here for? And if so, then standardized testing will not achieve that. And so we need to refocus the idea and the concept that teaching the humanities is essential. And you know, we fight that battle every day. And you know, STEM is important. Listen, we're coming out hopefully the other end of this pandemic thanks to science and technology. But that doesn't mitigate the power and value of a humanities education as well.
Thank you for both of your responses, Glenn and Stu. And I think with genocide education, once it exists in the school, it can be controversial, so to speak, into what to include and what to exclude, because not all mass atrocities are labeled as genocide. There's conflicting views as to what qualifies as genocide. So, Stu, I'm going to continue with you and then go to Erna on where do you think the line is as to what to include in a curriculum?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's kind of a it's kind of a moving target to a degree. It changes. You know, if you look at what David Simon was talking about earlier, you know, the genocides of the 20th century have somewhat of a different tone to it than I'm not sure that's the best word, but a different quality to it than the genocides of the 21st century have. So it does make it more challenging. Even if you just look at the number of definitions of the term genocide and how does that compare with understanding crimes against humanity? Is one more of a group focus, genocide more of a group focus, and crimes against humanity more of an individual focus? So it's not easy. And I think I will say this, and then I'll shut up. But I will say that I think it's important that we look not only at the genocides, but we need to look, and Dr. Stanton, I'm sure I can't wait for his presentation later in the day, but what leads up to all of this? I mean, I think the psychology of genocide is also an essential component to understanding how this all happens. So my sort of foundational thinking is you need to look at the psychology of what can get people to think that the killing of another human being is nothing extraordinary. And then how do we define this term, genocide? And then here are some examples. And where do we go from here? And that's sort of the course in a nutshell. And with all of them being equally as important.
Yeah, I agree with Stu on his like input about sort of having to like look at all those aspects. I think if we fall into like trying to like figure out what is genocide and what isn't, we're falling into technicalities, and we were wanting more of like an emotional piece when we come to genocide education, and because even we would like fall into like legal terms and essential, but like we're not in law school. We're trying to teach people how to like help out others. We're advocates essentially. Like education, I believe, is a platform for advocacy for helping out others, where there's no bias. There shouldn't be biases of like who deserves rights and who doesn't deserve rights, who deserves not to be killed and not who doesn't deserve to be killed. And that's kind of if we look at those, like what is on the brink of genocide, what is a mass atrocity, I feel like we should pay attention to all of them, because if we don't, we are missing vital aspects of prevention that we can talk about within the course by, yes, this may not be considered a genocide in legal terminology, but it is on the brinks of it. So what can we do to campaign against it getting even worse? Or do we just wait until, for how long? Because it takes even a longer time to wait until something is even considered genocide by international bodies or the international community, where that falls into biases as well. So I feel like we kind of need to include everything in the whole scope of these issues, because if we don't, we're kind of going against our like stance on like survivor testimony and giving people a voice who have gone through something horrible, and just like ignoring like these vital elements of like survivors and their stories. So we had to include all of that, no matter what it is, because genocide education is human rights education, essentially.
No, you make great points on just the balance that needs to be there in genocide education. Because you're right, we're not in law school, even though genocide has a legal terminology as well as a more societal definition. And if you incorporate too much of the technicalities, you might scare high school students away because that's not what they're there to learn. I believe we have one more question on my end that I'm going to use to wrap up our discussion before we dive into the Q&A. And as always, keep them coming. I see some really good questions so far. Claire, this is going to be directed towards you, and I would love to, after your response, open it up to the other panelists. But what are some ways, because you obviously have experience in this, what are some ways students can advocate for genocide education in their high school? Because a lot of the times their classes don't exist and they might not even be aware of it.
Yes, I think this is very, very important. And unfortunately, I can't give a one-size-fits-all answer, but I can do my best to give as much advice, because I definitely think that genocide education is definitely not a one-size-fits-all problem. And so when I give this answer, it definitely is based off of personal experience and what I would suggest to any students or any teachers or educators who are watching this panel, whether it's live or you're watching the recording. I think it's so important just to realize what education is already existing. I think when we're looking at genocide education, it's important that in a lot of cases, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We have the tools that we need, but it's how we utilize them. And a lot of that goes back to what was brought up before with teacher and educator training as well as funding. And when we're looking at what we can do as students or as teachers in our school building, I think just starting off is looking at what we have in our school. Maybe you don't know that it's covered in this class or that class, or maybe it's not covered at all. And discovering that can really help you understand where to bridge the gaps. The next step, I think, would definitely be also looking at your school district. That is what I originally started out doing, and looking at what was in the school district code and what was suggested. And what I saw was definitely something that was not just disappointing for me, but it was really a learning experience. Understanding that there's very little talked about this in middle and high school, and how does this really prepare students to look at human rights in general? Because I think when looking at genocide or mass atrocities, whether you're talking about the past, the present, or ones that may occur in the future, I definitely think it's important to understand how that not only shapes history, but also how it has an impact on the way that we live our lives, whether or not our people or our nation is directly the ones associated with the genocide or mass atrocity. And I think that that's something that is also a really important point to note. And so I think looking at what is at a district level, and then if you have the ability to look at the state level, I know that when I got involved, something that shocked me was seeing how many schools I could talk to someone from a school 10 miles away, and they could have, some people didn't even know what the Holocaust was. They didn't even know who Hitler was. Hitler was someone that they joked about. And so when talking to these students, so many people were just unaware and uneducated about these topics. And to a lot of people that I met on my journey and my mission to do this in Oregon with a mandate, I met so many people who said, I can't believe it isn't taught. I got it at this school in 1970 and it was all fine, but we have to look at that education changes. And I think, I can't remember who mentioned it, but the fact that it's a moving target. And when we have something like that, you could have it taught in one classroom, and the classroom next door, it could not be mentioned at all. And those students not in that classroom may never hear about these atrocities throughout their life. So I think it's very important to look at what you can do, not just within your community, but within your state, but also look at other resources. Could you potentially partner with an organization if this is something you're interested in? We're talking genocide education, it happens in the classroom. And I want to make that something that is definitely very much a message that people get out of this. Genocide education can start in a classroom. A classroom is a great space to talk about genocide education, but what you do beyond that can really have an impact, not just in the mass atrocity space, but also in the human rights space. So I want to just give that, and I know that there's some stuff in the Q&A that might also address that, but that is just my perspective on it. And I encourage people to get involved in whatever way they see fit, because you don't have to be an expert to be able to make change in this space.
No, thank you. And I know I said I wanted everyone's perspective on that question, but I want to make sure we have enough time for these awesome questions that are coming in. And I'm going to start off with Greg's question about teachers encouraging their students. So, Glenn, I'm going to start with you, and then if we have time, go to what Stu thinks. And I'm just going to read the question for recording's sake, although I know everyone has access to it. How can teachers encourage their students to personally engage in efforts for genocide prevention? Could they do internships with genocide prevention NGOs, start a stand chapter, write articles for media that teachers help them edit, etc.? So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, and thanks for that, Greg. Frankly, a little intimidating to have you in the audience, by the way. So just so you know, yeah, no, I mean, I think that is a really key question for all of us who do this work, and I think the starting point for anything we would like to encourage our students to do is to be explicit about that and to make that a part of the expectation of the course. So you have to be deliberate in developing those skills as learning objectives, and you have to make them relevant in terms of your assessments and expectations. So, students do, like we all do, the things that we're rewarded and expected to do. So if you're serious about student engagement in your classroom, you deliberately put a focus on that in your course design, from the content to the learning objectives to the assessments and to the evaluations. So in my course, which we attempt to integrate experiential learning and authentic project-based learning into the genocide studies course, it's built in as the capstone project. It doesn't go all the way to an internship, right? Supporting a full-blown internship experience is probably larger than most of our courses, particularly at say the first or second year undergraduate level can sustain. But you certainly have opportunities to build in experiences and connections for students to organizations and entities doing good work. And I think organizations like STAND are exactly the kinds of examples that you want to put before your students as opportunities. Once you've done that, once you've displayed those opportunities, once you've provided those examples, you also want to build in time for your students to explore with each other. Right? Part of taking action, part of all of education that we need to shift is this idea that these experiences are individual experiences for students by themselves, that somehow they have to take action independently, that somehow their achievement, their learning is divorced from that of their classmates or their peers. So really, it's also important, in my experience, to build in opportunities for students to organize among themselves, to discuss these issues and these opportunities and share their perspectives, and to come up with shared plans for implementing action in different ways. The experience for the students in learning is much richer oftentimes, but then the outcomes for them, what they're able to accomplish because they're doing them together, are also more impressive. And then the last thing I'll say is to cultivate strong relationships with organizations or community members beyond your classroom that have real experience, have real resources, have real commitments to doing this work in locally to globally. Those relationships that you have as an educator will translate into connections you can make for your students and opportunities for them, again, if they're beyond the confines of a particular semester, want to then go and pursue that internship, want to get more deeply involved, want to become leaders in their own right. So those relationships that you have as an instructor will allow your students then to begin to form those and make the most of those as well.
Bree, just real quickly, having started my teaching career, I think it was around the time of Lincoln's second inaugural. The one thing that I can take away from that is Lots can be learned outside the four walls of my classroom. And you are a living example of that. If there's an opportunity for a secondary school, to travel, having taken students on study tours, Holocaust study tours through Central and Eastern Europe, I can talk about these places forever in a classroom. But once you step on those graveyards, that hallowed ground, that is an experience that I don't think can be replicated in a classroom. And it is going to change you. You are not the same person once you have visited some of those places. And if you wanted to change perspective, visiting, whether it's a Treblinka or a Theresienstadt, that is a difference that will make a difference. And so I would urge, if you're looking for things to do within a classroom, I would urge those. I mean, there are other ways and places to visit, but if you have an opportunity to do that, that is life altering as far as I can tell.
Yes, I've had personal experiences on that trip that have been life-changing, and I can recall them like they were yesterday. And I think Sarah's question relates to this. She asks, learning theory talks about the need for authentic learning experiences. For example, science through labs, history through primary source of evaluation, etc. What are some disciplinary specific skills for human rights educators to employ to do genocide education? And so, Erna, I'd like your perspective on this from a student, because you talk about a lot of hands-on elements and getting empathy and more than just the technicalities of genocide education. So what are your thoughts on this question?
I think it definitely needs to be an interdisciplinary approach when you talk about genocide, because there are so many aspects of it that genocide falls into so many topics, so many different, I guess, majors, or if we want to go into like college routes. But you can look into, with genocide, there's like a sort of cultural history on it, cultural competence and cultural destruction of that relates to genocide. There's the psychology of genocide and why, how trauma affects, how trauma is an after effect of genocide. And then there's history, there's the politics, there's the law, there's many aspects of it that need to be considered into this approach. And then, of course, the hands-on. I think I really like what Stu said about bringing in those, going to those trips and having those opportunities for students to actually, while hands-on campaigning is great as well, but you don't really get a feeling until you actually visit sort of the memorial centers. It's as easy as going to a Holocaust Memorial museum here in the US, but it's also, I know from experience, going to Memorial Center in Srebrenica. It's a whirlwind of emotions that come out, and there's pictures, there's firsthand testimony, there's something that ends up grabbing you much more and makes you more passionate to go into this work, that where you become a better fighter against genocide. And I think the end goal for us is to really prevent genocide. No matter how much it's an intriguing topic, it shouldn't be as intriguing. It's like a sort of dark humor type of thing, but it shouldn't be as intriguing. Like, our end goal should be to stop most genocides from ever happening again in mass atrocities, even though it seems sort of out of reach, but it shouldn't be out of reach.
Can I just jump in here, because Erna, I think you're being a little modest, and both you and Bree actually are a great example of exactly how this learning can take place through the development of disciplinary skills, given your work on the ICTY digital archive. Right, so the the discipline would be history in this particular instance, but your work to help process, tag, and then make available this documentation. So this is a project housed in .impact that focuses on making available a set of documents related to the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. And this essential work of documentation is absolutely an anti-genocidal practice, right? Of course, we know that essential to the genocidal frame is the idea of erasing the fact that the genocide happened at all. available. And the imperative to carefully document and present and to make available exactly these primary source documents, videos, testimonies, I think is really, really essential. And both of you have just been so critical to building up this archive and making it available in ways that are useful to students, to teachers, to researchers, to lawyers, to activists, and others. So I just wanted to celebrate Erna and Bree's work in exactly this area.
Thank you. You're too kind. There are several questions that I wish we would have time to answer. So maybe, Glenn, if you don't mind answering this last question, I think is really crucial in just a few sentences. Anna's asking, why not sooner? Why not sooner for genocide education? Why are we waiting until high school?
Yeah, no, the answer to that's yeah, absolutely. No, you know, Anne, you're absolutely right. There's no reason why the first time you encounter some of these themes has to be in high school. Obviously, there's a set of age-appropriate kinds of topics and resources and materials that you have to be careful. But if we go into this understanding that the fundamental objective of genocide education is anti-genocide education, then integrating the underlying knowledge, skills, attitudes, and relationships that happen in a high school classroom, say, focused on the history of the Holocaust and then does a deep dive, can be integrated, you know, throughout the K-12 sequence. You know, you have an opportunity, again, the connection to anti-racism, to social and emotional learning, to the development of empathy, and also to the cultivation of student voice and agency, which also shouldn't wait until high school to begin, can absolutely be integrated prior to, you know, students setting foot in a high school.
Well, I think it's time to wrap up. I cannot thank you all enough, panelists, for your expertise and taking the time out of your schedule to be with us today. Audience, thank you so much for your questions and also taking the time out of your day. Again, this session will be recorded and posted on our website, which I believe you must have been able to access since you came today. And if you have time, we do have a workshop on cultural destruction in about a minute. That's going to be interactive, so the more audience, the better. But again, thank you so, so much, everyone. And it was such an important discussion, and I'm really glad that we took the time to talk about it. It's also just so nice to see you all. So thank you.
Thanks, Bree.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks so much. Take care.
Have a good day, everybody.